Hey, welcome to Pretty Blunt. I'm your host, Jaime Lipowitz. I am here with my partner in crime, Sabine Schwirtz. Sabine, what is the hot gossip this week? What is going on, girl?
So technically we're filming this after 420, but 420 always means event season. And so the buds have been talking a lot about what they do and don't like at different events. And I feel like we have a lot of event hot gossip.
Love it. Well, it's pretty timely because we're talking to Katie Pringle after this, who runs lots of cannabis events. But what are the buds saying?
The biggest takeaway so far that I've heard is one, actually the music is too loud, which is but it's a signifier of something bigger because the bud tenders want to be able to talk to the reps. And they literally find it useless when they're going to an event and they can't talk to you.
Well, for sure. But I mean, I think I would, counter that by what's the purpose of the event? If the purpose of the event is to vibe out and smoke a lot of weed, it doesn't matter if the music's really loud because you're not going there for an educational opportunity. But if the purpose is to go and get educated, well, why is the music blaring? You're there to have a two-way conversation.
So I think that's a really good point. Like you mentioning purpose right now is really specific as well, because the bud tenders literally said that beyond the music being annoying, one of the things that they want at every single event is they just want to know what they're showing up to. Because I think that's it, is sometimes they think they're showing up to have a conversation and an interaction, and then that's not actually what the event is. They don't know what size of bag to bring with them. They don't know what to wear. They actually just want to know what the purpose of the event is that they're going to and what the actual agenda is.
But to be fair, I don't think the organizers know all the time what the purpose of the event is.
100%. And actually, one of the buds said something really interesting about if the purpose is just to sample, that's fine. But they actually are frustrated when a rep is just throwing samples out and they're like, no, I actually want to talk to you. And so, it's again, it's really interesting to just hear them kind of they're kind of like the canaries in the coal mine, you know? We know that events aren't always perfect and that they're difficult for a lot of brands to understand what the purpose is. And the bud tenders are literally saying that. They're like, we just want to know what we're showing up for. I want to know if it's education. I want to know if it's a party. It can't be both.
Well, no, it can't be both. But, I think what's interesting is sometimes the brands don't know either. So they can't tell the bud tender. And so you look at when there was that big Health Canada audit back in February, March, and all of so many of the LPs stopped sampling, couldn't sample it. We had one of our partners who had committed to an event series say, what's the point in me showing up to this? I can't give out samples. I don't think I think this is a waste of money. And I gave him the counsel that it's never a waste of money to have a brand experience and deliver human touch to something. And he went and did the event with no samples, did not give out a single pre-roll. And he said it was one of the best events that he did because he could have real conversations with the bud tenders. He could spend time chatting with them. And I mean, this brand's really popular. So his booth was, really well populated. But I think it just shows that it's not about the sample, it's about the engagement and how you're going to engage with the bud tenders.
Well, and we often hear that the bud tenders go to these events because they want the FaceTime. There are stores that don't see reps. I think everyone thinks that everyone gets seen all the time, but unless you're in the GTA, you actually might not see a rep for 6 months. And so, they're going out of this way to commute because they actually might have a question for you.
Totally. But I also think that that's why our PKs are so well populated. We get 100 people out for an online hour because they want to learn. And if you live in North Bay or Sudbury or Northern Ontario, 5, 6, 7 hours from Toronto, which is the hub of everything, you're not getting reps. You're not getting access to events. You're not getting any of those things. So how do you learn?
You and I talk about this ad nauseum, but what is the strategic alignment for your event? Is your alignment to help push a core SKU, or is your alignment for that event to celebrate something new? Because on the flip side of that, again, free weed is not really that exciting anymore. It is, but it isn't, right? But like we see bud tenders all the time that are like, oh, just opened this pre roll from an event in the summer. Don't remember anything about it. And I'm like, right.
We see it on the feed, they dump their haul, and I would say that 70% of that stuff doesn't get consumed by the budtender. It gets given away as a gift, it gets put in a drawer and forgotten about. Maybe they light, your 1 gram joint, take 2 puffs of it, put it out, can't remember. My personal favorite is when the joint is completely unbranded. So you've gone, spent thousands of dollars, rallied your team, got in there, set up your booth, you hand them the joint, they get home and they have no idea what it is. And it's so short-sighted.
Well, and I think that's it is like, I think the central conversation here is like, what is the purpose, right? Because the purpose of the sample is not just to trial it. Like, this isn't like someone getting a Red Bull on the street. It doesn't really work like that in our space and place. And like, we know the most success really comes when there's like that education and that conversation first before the sample is given. Whereas the sample is an addition to your education. It's not the cheap way of not talking to someone.
Well, you called out Red Bull, and that's a consumer brand. So the idea is, like, get a consumer to try the product so then they remember it, they like it, they buy it that time, they buy it again, like whatever that is for.
But you already know who Red Bull is, even if you've never tried it before.
The purpose of cannabis brands giving out samples is for budtenders to be able to sell that product to end consumers. And so they're not consumers. You don't need them to love your product. And I think a lot of brands think that that's the key is like, I'm going to make this so that the budtender loves it and the budtender remembers to sell it. But just because the budtender loves it doesn't mean they know how to talk about it. Doesn't mean that it's the right product for, half their consumers or whatever that thing is. And it's like you get so far down the line, but the simple things that matter don't get executed. The education is more important than the sample, in my opinion, because you got to give them the reason to believe. The reason to believe is the thing that they're going to buy into. The sample doubles down on that reason to believe. But if you just give them the sample and they don't understand why it's valuable, why they should care about it, what the brand is, how they're represented in the brand, doesn't matter.
Well, and there's a huge difference between saying to a customer, "Oh, yeah, this is a good pre-roll," and you have nothing else to say about it. All you can say is, "This is good," versus, "This is good, and I know that it was grown here, and, like, it's got a really high terpene percentage." Like, there are again, that education is actually so much more important to the customer interaction.
Of course. But if the brand doesn't deliver that to the budtender can't deliver that to the brand. And I think the budtender can't deliver that to the consumer. But I think what is the issue in that is that the brand hasn't done the work to know why somebody should buy it or what the reason to believe is. We see a lot of these like psychographic profiles and they don't tell me a damn thing. They don't tell me what people are interested in. They talk about very baseline surface level things, age, income, geography, but like does your customer like sports? Is your customer into health and fitness and wellness? Are they beauty aficionados whatever the thing is that your product is built for them and this is the reason why. And so often it's so surface. It's simple to do, but it's not easy to do. And that's the key is I think people think that, oh, we're CPG, we created a psychographic profile, check. But they're going wide and they're not going deep because I still think they think their products are for everybody.
Everybody always thinks their products are for everybody, and I'm so happy you brought up the psychographic profile thing because you and I have talked about this ad nauseum, of course, again, too, because again, exactly that, like me being a 32-year-old who makes X amount of money has actually almost nothing to do with my purchases. I purchase a wide variety of ranges depending on my needs and what's going on in my life or where I'm going and what I'm doing. And like, I think what I would love to see in cannabis is people thinking about like the interest profile of their consumer. Exactly that. The interest alignments are actually the most interesting way to talk about who your customer is and understand who your customer is.
Well, because money is such an arbitrary thing, and I think that there is times when I make a budget purchase, and there are times when I make a premium purchase, and that has nothing to do with how much money I make. It has to do with my thought process and mood at that time in my life or that day, you know? Some days I don't wanna spend a lot of money. I don't know, I just spent it on something else. Other days, I've been, really good. And maybe I'm going to splurge on something. And so I don't necessarily think that the amount of income somebody has determines what their value equation is. And that's the difference is value is so subjective. It's only what anybody thinks it's worth. And so it's hard to put like you make $100,000 a year, and so you're our customer. It's so wide, and I think brands have to start going deep. Going back to the events, a lot of them don't know who they are or why they exist. It's the same thing. I think that's the problem across the board in this industry is people don't know who they are talking to. They don't know why they're talking to them at that moment. And that's where a lot of things get lost in translation.
Because we're not just selling pre rolls to everybody.
So, like, is the purpose of the event to get out 5,000 pre-rolls?
That might be a purpose. To me, that's not an effective purpose, and then we can dive into effectiveness. But, like, if that is the purpose, great, check off. People have done that, but that's not always or often the purpose. Often the purpose is to build relationships and have brand awareness.
Totally. But I also think a lot of the B2B events are disguised as consumer events. And so they think the brand might think they're talking to consumers, or the brand wants to deliver like a brand experience, which, like, hate to say it, is really an ego project because they love to see their work come to life. And I understand that. But I would argue why? Why are you doing that? The other thing is that a lot of these events, again, they don't know why they're there or what the purpose is. You're also shouting in a sea of noise. And so how are you able to stand out? Like when there's 10, 20, 30 other brands there, you have 2 to 4 hours, like whatever the time period is. How can you like deliver your message and make any kind of impact when there's all these brands around?
That's a really good point. One of the buds mentioned that like they would love to see more events where there's like timelines of like, oh, okay, this pitch is going to be on at this time at noon and you'll be able to hear it. Oh, you'll be able to hear from this brand at 12:30. Because that is the FaceTime they want. They want to hear the information. The purpose is that they want to learn from you. And like we heard that from Sam, our podcast guest a couple weeks ago, like he stood up at an event and like crowd yelled, which was effective, and I'm so happy he did that. But that's just a showcase of how that event purpose was misaligned.
Totally, but I also think, like, Sam's an anomaly in some ways because he knows why he's there and what the point of it is because he runs his P&L and it's his money. Lots of brands don't, like, maybe they run a P&L for sure, but it's not their money, and it's not, like, the lifeblood of the business doesn't depend on this event working or doing the thing it's supposed to.
Do you think that, like, the marketing regulations, in air quotes, because they're regulations, we have to follow them, but there's definitely ways to work within them, like, kind of pigeonhole everyone into it because 'cause they're like, "Oh, we just need to have an age-gated event." Check. That's our box. We did an event.
I think there's an incredible lack of critical thinking in this industry. And so a lot of things are check marking a box for a KPI or, we know that brands do events, so that's the tactic and like check, but there's no actual critical thinking of like, what are we trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of this? In beauty or other industries, you would never have like multiple brands talk to trade at an event. Like, unless Sephora is hosting a trade day for their staff specifically, and like their employees. you see often you have, branded dinners, influencer dinners, all of those things where one brand gets to own the message and own the audience. And yes, of course, it's a higher, cost per engagement. But I would argue that while it's costly and the other things are a cheaper cost per engagement, the other stuff is way more expensive because it doesn't work.
Well, and so going back to that, brand is your CPG brands that people buy from. It's not your corporate umbrella identity.
Well, yeah.
No, I know, but like it seems crazy to say that, but like people show up all of the time with their corporate umbrella and expect consumers and bud tenders to be like, yeah, I'm going to remember your 15 different brands underneath your kind of generic roster. Like they're not going to know those things. It is about the actual brand on the sales floor.
Of course. So, like, let's look at Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola is a beverage company, obviously. You have your hero brand of Coca-Cola, which is a product and a brand in and of itself. But then many people might not know that Coca-Cola owns Dasani. They own Smartwater. They own Fanta. They own all these other brands. And you would never go to a Fanta event or a Dasani event or whatever that thing is and have Coca-Cola everywhere. It's just confusing. And so often, I think the other thing that happens in this industry, and we see this a lot with the budtenders and our own brand, is a brand will say to us, "Oh, we told them that." They know that. And you might know that because you live in your, microcosm of a world and you know that you've said that 20 times and you've lived it.
100%. And like when you're going in and there's 15 brands, there are 15 brands at a show and you're showing up with 5 brands, you're watering down your own space. Like I think the strategy behind like who is this event for? Is this event the right need for this customer, which might be the bud tender? It might be an actual customer. But, like you have to show up right the first time with one cohesive message.
I don't think they know how to do that. And I think we're watching a few brands deliver a masterclass in that. And they're not spending a ton of money. It's not about the dollar amount of the budget. It's how you deliver the messages effectively, And they don't know why they're there. They don't know who their audience is. They don't know what the purpose of the message they're trying to deliver that day is. And those are all things that money can't buy. You can't throw dollars at those things. It really takes critical thinking. I think a lot of people think that I think events are stupid or useless. I've heard several people say to me over the last 6 months, events are dead. And that's crazy. Events are not dead. But what I think is dead is pointless events. Why are you there? What is the purpose? You're going to pay 10,000 bucks to show up at something where there's 30 other brands. Why wouldn't you take that money and own the party, own the narrative, own the conversation? But I think it's an evolution. I think as the industry evolves, we see what works, we see what doesn't, we see other people's failures. We also see brands who have failed small versus brands who have failed big. And so now we have, the last 6, 7, 8 years of this legal market that we can look back. And if you take the time to think about it, you can see what's missing and what isn't. But I'll say it again, critical thinking doesn't exist in this industry in the way that it should.
I think that's the best way to end it.
Great. I love that. When we come back, we're here with Katie Pringle. Hey, welcome back to Pretty Blunt. I'm your host, Jaime Lipowitz, and I'm joined today with Katie Pringle from Marigold PR and Tether. Hi, Katie.
Hi. Thanks for having me, Jamie.
I'm ready to jump right into this. Tell me about Tether. What do you guys do there?
Yeah, so Tether's been around for about 4 years now. We do activations and engagements for brands with bud tenders in the space. We're definitely most known for our sampling events. That's been a pretty hot topic and pretty big service for us over the past couple of years. I definitely wouldn't have guessed that's exactly where things are going, but sort of, riding this cannabis wave and serving the industry as needed. But we also do content marketing. We have a print edition that we do for retailers. And then we do traditional PR services on the Marigold side as well for cannabis brands.
Awesome. So you're pretty deep in the cannabis events world. I really like your events because I think they're, tight and targeted, and there's a clear reason why people, show up to them and brands show up to them as well. What do you think the current state of cannabis events look like? What have you noticed like change and evolve?
I mean, like over time, events have evolved dramatically. If we're even looking just pre legalization, like Lyft was sort of running the show at that time. And I actually think the industry had a lot of heart for what Lyft was doing back then during those times. And that was really casting a wide net, right? Like anyone working in cannabis in any capacity, there was sort of something there for them, and it was sort of the go to. What we've noticed is things really niche down, become a lot more targeted, become a lot more focused, and also providing brands of different sizes opportunities, which I think is really important overall for the health of the industry. And so ensuring that there are abilities to activate in secondary markets, not just Toronto, not just Vancouver, but reaching budtenders where they are and retailers where they are, I think has been a really big shift sort of in the event landscape. And like we were saying, getting a little bit more targeted, getting a little bit more focused. We see that both on like the budtender retailer side and then, the likes of StratCan and Grow Up and the way they're doing it from a B2B perspective. And I think that that shows a lot of promise because at the end of the day, all our time is so valuable and we're stretched so thin. So having events where you really know that you're going to get some ROI and you know the focus, I think makes a really big difference.
That's a really good point around the secondary markets because I think, I live in the GTA, you live in the GTA. Like, it is a bubble here. Like, we don't, go outside of our zones, and everyone comes here to us. So we take a lot of things for granted that way. But the truth is that a lot of weed gets sold in Northern Ontario. A lot of weed gets sold in Winnipeg. Like, there's other, less sexy markets or where that drive volume. And so how can brands effectively, reach them and get there?
Yeah, for sure. And they it beyond the brands, the attendees in the secondary markets are so grateful you showed up. Like Hamilton, we sell out all of our events. They're both from a brand and a consumer, like budtender perspective, because they're grateful for you to be there. Hamilton to Toronto in rush hour is like 2 hours, and people forget that, right? Like that's not tangible or sustainable for a lot of people to get out to the city center for everything. I think, the locations like Kelowna, for example, again, so grateful for you to show up in Edmonton. And we're actually seeing a lot of success targeting the secondary markets, both from an attendee perspective, and then the brands are really happy to get a chance to reach a lot of the stores at one time. It's expensive, especially the further out you go, the further spread apart everyone is, less saturated, which, that's a whole other conversation. Um, but it allows the reps to talk to a lot of stores and their buyers at the same time. And we'll talk about this more later, I'm sure, but it really is the sum of all parts. If you're going out to a secondary market and doing an event, spending time in that market and being a part of that market is also really important. And so I think it kind of feeds into the overall strategy.
Totally. I mean, those secondary markets, they don't get any attention. It's expensive to have reps service them in a lot. Like, I mean, Hamilton, not so much, but when you think about how spread out the country is, and even Ontario, how spread out the province is, it's hard to service a lot of those territories. And so I think what you're doing is like a really great sales enablement tool because it's a very targeted approach to give an in-person touch to something and, shake hands and kiss babies and talk to the retailers and the bud tenders, but it makes them feel seen, right? Toronto gets reps all the time. There's a steady stream of people walking into the stores, popping in, but when you're like not in a heavily populated area, like you're lucky if you get a rep coming into your store every 6 months. And so
Yep.
how do you get access, to that information? It's not published, on websites. It's what we do is so nuanced and niche. And so I think it's a really great way for brands to get scale on a human touch with a lot of those markets.
Yeah, thank you. And we do hear that from the stores. Like some of the GTA stores, I get 12 reps in a day. That is just wild. And then, the store is an hour outside of Ottawa, might not see anyone for weeks at a time. And that's sort of an exaggerated version, but not every retailer is having the same brand experience. Um, and I think the other thing that's really cool about some of the secondary market activations is we're reaching a lot of independents, which again are really difficult, right? Like it's you don't have a key account manager on these independents in the same way you would with some of the larger scale retailers. And with those guys, we're getting out the owner, the buyer, the decision maker. So those are really important conversations. We still do have some bud tenders that are just there. They are just there for the samples and they're in and out for the samples. But that's only a small component of the whole audience. 40 to 50% of our attendees identify as buyers or decision makers. And so it's important for brands to remember that even though these people also identify as bud tenders because a lot of them are doing all of the jobs, wearing all the hats at their independent stores, that these are really important conversations and touch points to be having. And it might be the first time that you're having it with someone slightly outside of your territory.
Yeah, it can open a lot of doors for sure, for sure. Do you think you mentioned 40 to 50% are like buyers, decision makers? Do you think that your events are a better distribution tool, or do you think they're a better velocity tool to get, education and get the audience either bringing in the product or selling the product and getting it off the shelf?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think it's a mix of both depending on where that brand is at in the market. Um, we have some brands love the events because they're able to bring their reps that have relationships already and they're able to spend a bit more time and they're able to create a bit of, camaraderie and a more relaxed kind of conversation with these people they already know. And then some brands are brand new to market. So that's a whole different strategy. But again, sampling is a tactic that's part of an overall marketing plan, and I know you feel the same
I
way.
was gonna say you are preaching to the choir here, girl. Like,
It's one tactic, and something we're always talking to our partner brands about is ways to activate in a more substantial fashion that's going to create memories, create moments, help with your brand storytelling, which obviously as PR people we wholeheartedly believe in. Some take us up on that offer, some follow our advice and some don't. And so, there is a difference. You can make a really big difference in terms of how you show up and the things you're thinking about before, during, and after, just like any other sort of marketing execution. But the sample is just one component. So, like, never, don't die on that sword. Like, that's just one a piece of the pie that all these brands need to think about.
absolutely agreed. One of the things Sabine and I were talking about at the start of this conversation is like the lack of critical thinking in this industry. So oftentimes I think brands think like, oh, we're going to show up to this event. There's, 500 bud tenders or whatever, decision makers, like whoever's coming. We're going to get out samples. And they don't actually think any deeper than that. Um, versus other brands, and I see it in my business as well, other brands who show up prepared, who know why they're doing it, what they're hoping to get out of it, what they're measuring. They're collecting, data points from the audience, or the purpose of it is to deliver key messaging on a product. It's not just so like the tactic of the sample is the driver to something else. It's
Yeah.
not the whole campaign.
Yeah, for sure. And, we've all worked in marketing outside of cannabis, like programming, yeah, uh, all of us on this chat. Programming events with a before, during, and after strategy. Like I came from television. That was what it was all about. Like you're moving your audience forward. You're considering what they're thinking about now and how you can tap into that audience for later. And kind of pulling all the strings. And, especially if you're a smaller brand, when you're going to these events, it is not that hard to be memorable, honestly. Like You can layer in tactics that will provide some social halo for your brand. You can do follow up information because you're getting all the information of the attendees coming out. You can capture, like you said, capture information on site. There's so much that brands can be doing if they widen their view on the value of that execution and make it part of a campaign rather than just one interaction and one touch point.
Yeah, I think a lot of brands though think that they can throw money at things and that's going to like be the check mark to like success, right? Like, oh, I did that event, it didn't work. And, I think they don't ever take a lot of ownership over the various pieces of value to your point of like how you make that work. I always think of High Buds Club, and I think Tether is very similar. You're giving the brands the opportunity to engage. You're providing the stage for them to show up on. But, a Rihanna concert is very different than like a classical pianist concert. Like they're both on a stage, right? It's just the product is different, the end results and feeling is different depending on, you know, which one you're showing up to. And I don't know that the brands necessarily always take advantage of the full opportunity. So, like you mentioned, you give out the attendee list. With High Buds Club flights, we give you the store list of where everything went. And I've been giving the store list for 5 years, and brands only now are like, that I've worked with for a long time, are like, "Hey, can I get that store list?" And I'm like, "You get it after every campaign."
You have
Like,
10 of them
you
already.
already
Yeah.
have that.
Yeah.
So I just think sometimes they're like, they have so many things, there's so many moving parts, and they don't maximize the opportunity of the single thing in front of them and like do simple things well. I think they have to add in all these other components to like make it pop or be successful.
For sure, for sure, and it's like everything can have legs, like, if you're scrappy, that's your position on sort of any marketing effort that you're investing in.
Okay, so Katie, you see a lot of these events, you see a lot of, people planning them, engaging with them. Often I would imagine it's like a sales arm and a marketing arm. Do you see a difference based on who's running it, what the output looks like and what the success levels look like?
100%. Um, it's It's very different. Like, sometimes sales and marketing, as you know, at LPs are the same individual. Like, it's the same person running both departments, which I actually think is a pretty strategic move, especially if they're able to have the right resources underneath them to execute on both sides of the coin. We find that when it's sales focused, those people are very interested in the follow up list and they're very interested in the relationships, but at times can fall short on the on site execution, right? Because that's not necessarily their wheelhouse. They're not necessarily thinking about signage and swag and social activations in the same capacity. And then the reverse can be true, right? Where you're dealing more with the marketer, everything looks beautiful on site, but they're not doing any additional store visits, or perhaps the sales team's been a little disconnected from the opportunities connected to that event. So, I definitely having both pieces of thinking on event marketing and experiential marketing is important across the board, but especially in our arena where reaching decision makers can be so challenging. We definitely need both sides of the coin. We know that brand reputation, along with the brand reps and also sampling, equally affect referrals. So if your brand doesn't have a great reputation, and if your sales rep is not building good relationships, sampling is not going to do a whole lot for you because you definitely need all three of those pieces to be working together.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real fine balance of like pushing interest and awareness and bringing them down the reason to believe. But ultimately, the purpose is to get a deal done, right? So either you're trying to get that product on the shelf or you've gotten that product on the shelf and how do you effectively like get it off reordered? And I think at times there is a disconnect between sales and marketing. I look at this industry, I think, from a very sales minded commercial lens because that's my background. Like that's always the world that I've lived in. But marketing is supposed to drive demand. Sales is supposed to, close the deal and get the deal done. And oftentimes, I don't think the brands know why they're doing the thing they're doing. Are they doing this to get awareness, to bring,
Mm.
bud tenders or store owners or whatever down that funnel for the rec to come in and then close the deal? Or is the purpose to, talk shop, shake hands, kiss babies, and get the deal signed, the day of? And I don't know that they always know the difference.
For sure. And I think a lot of them are still figuring that out. I think even for a lot of the brands who's going to the events, they're sorting out. Like, you're not going to get the same sort of response with perhaps just some hired support, like a brand ambassador that isn't, I mean, kind of some external support that you're bringing in for the event. We're starting to see that. That's what you see in the outside world. If you see, Pepsi representatives at an event, they certainly aren't the C-suite or the founders. But in our space, you're seeing a mix of everything. And so how a founder shows up versus the VP of sales who's sometimes building the set or building their display kind of in advance, you don't typically see that in other spaces. So what I think is interesting for the events that we go to, sort of all kinds in our space, is that there's always more decision makers on the floor than you might expect or you would experience in other situations.
Do you mean decision makers from the brand end or decision makers from the retail end?
For sure, both. For sure, both. Yeah. And it's funny because even like the buyers for some of the larger LPs, or sorry, for the larger retailers, they will come out to events, but they know how to be a bit quiet about it. And so that's the other interesting thing. It's like you could be talking to someone that really has a lot of influence from some of the larger retailers that you might not have met before. And so you really have to make sure you're treating those people properly. Like you have to figure out and train your team on site how to speak to everyone who's coming out to the event. Because if you treat them like people who are there to trick or treat, that's how they're going to behave. And so, beyond your look and feel and beyond your setup, like, what is your story? What's your brand story? There's a brand that's no longer around, but they had the best story. They had a family related story. It was a family run farm. And people would come to the events and they would leave talking about this one particular brand who was probably the smallest brand there because they knew how to tell their brand story on site and make an impact well beyond just the sample. It's like, oh, now I'm invested. Now I'm invested in what this brand means and their values. And they had a chance to convey that. So it's definitely not impossible to be telling that story alongside providing them something amazing to take home.
Well, it's also, you live in the PR world. It's like brand 101. It's storytelling. Like I think often they think that, like, I go back to throwing money at things is going to do that storytelling for them, but it's actually doing very simple things that are free and doing them well, I think is more important. And it goes back to the lack of critical thinking in this industry. They don't always know why they're showing up, they don't know what they're trying to accomplish. And so if you don't know why you're doing the thing you're doing, it's just like, oh, we got to give out samples. Like everybody gives out samples. Well, it's not going to be an effective engagement. And from my perspective, what we see on the feed is that the bud tenders feel that. The bud
Mhm.
tenders know when they're being treated like, oh, this is trick or treating. We got to be there. Here, this is table stakes. Like, we actually don't care, like, what you think or if you care, versus the brands who, like, give it a bit more of a human touch and show up appropriately, and their success pays dividends.
For sure. And I have like a couple great examples of that. Like, Stewart Farms is one of our big partners and they know how to show up. They show up full of life, full of energy, happy to be there. They pre promote where they're going to be. They talk to their partners before they get there. They stand out because they're thrilled to be there and they're thrilled to have the conversations. And it's something brands should consider when they're looking for people to represent them at events. Like, you're competing with people with that level of passion. So, if you have some really shy brand ambassadors that aren't really telling your story and just kind of doing the bare minimum, like you're right, that's the feeling they're going to get. It's not going to be memorable. It's not going to be something that really makes an impact for them. But just, it doesn't always take a founder. Like obviously Stewart Farms, when Tanner shows up, that's a very special thing for people to meet a founder. But it doesn't always take that. But it definitely takes prep, understanding your story, understanding your key messages, and having some consistency. Because that goes sort of back to what you're saying about the critical thinking piece is like understanding your key messages and ensuring everyone on your team understands them is something that we kind of miss in this space. I think often for brands, they'll hire a couple marketers that are expected to understand the full gamut of everything related to marketing. Whereas if you're working at a corporate outside of the space, that job's probably for about 10 different people. And so I think sometimes that's the challenge that these marketers are facing because maybe they came from CPG, maybe they are extremely experienced, but PR and comms was never part of their role. And managing social and then, building a community is, that's quite a few different areas of skill that if they need to be hiring for.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I think there's a difference between startup mode and established mode, right? So you look at, previous CPG and maybe you worked at PepsiCo or General Mills or whatever. You get handed an established brand. You get handed messaging. You get handed, a visual identity. You also get handed a playbook in a lot of cases of we've done the hard work. This is what works. And here's your strategy. Now you have to go execute it. In this world, doesn't exist that way. Nothing
Yeah.
exists, right? And so it's really up to the brands to establish that communication, right? Like who the product is for, what the reasons to believe are. And also then having like a finger on the pulse to understand, is that resonating? Do they care? Is it working? And I believe those are two different skill sets. I think I am through and through a builder. I'm not a scaler. I know High Buds Club will get to a certain point. I'm going to get bored. I'm going to want to move on to something else. But then that becomes a very attractive opportunity for somebody with the skill set to scale an established brand. And that's not the skill set I have. And so I wonder if one of the key components and one of the things that a lot of these brands are missing in their hiring is looking for, marketers who can do those things, right? Like at this stage of the brand, because in a year, 3 years, 5 years, the brand's going to be different. But today it's not established.
Yeah. Yeah. We hear of so many brands that are like looking for a marketing coordinator and they want to hire a coordinator and they expect that coordinator to do a slew of marketing things along with admin and then also be kind of independent. And so that person doesn't exist. Like, a coordinator doesn't have the experience to make lucrative decisions and put together your brand fundamentals and all that. So it's funny because we have a lot of these conversations and they're like, yeah, we're hiring a coordinator. And it's like, but they don't have anyone else on their team. It's like in my opinion, you actually don't need a coordinator. You need an admin and you need a fractional CMO or someone, you need the best talent you can hire for your budget to build those foundational pieces so they don't get missed. Because you don't want to pay for someone to learn on the job necessarily. You want the person to bring you expertise. And so I think there's a little bit of thinking that needs to happen in terms of especially some of the scaling smaller LPs that they've proven themselves, they've got to a place of some profitability and now they're ready to take those next steps. I'm always encouraging them to think about hiring bigger thinking and even if it's just a project basis, but invest in that because you don't want a coordinator or someone very junior making up all of these key components that the entire company needs and the vision that everyone needs. And so that's not a place to save money in my opinion.
Well, I think it's a losing game, right? And we see, we're what, 6, 7 years in now at this point. We see the operators who have pulled ahead, who have real brands, who understand how to connect with either budtenders, retailers, consumers, like whatever that looks like, versus the ones who I think of as like amateurs. Like they're playing on a field in which they've had no training. and it's clear that they're being dominated because they don't even know how to show up. They don't even know the right equipment to put on.
Yeah, yeah. And it take this industry takes so much grit, as we both know all too well. And that's really admirable. And a lot of these small to mid-sized brands have got very far with the grit and determination and making smart financial choices. But c- not investing properly in your brand and marketing and a proper plan, that's that's crazy. Like there's no industry where they would say, all this stuff isn't important. They're fundamentals that brands need to understand.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I don't think they've made I don't think a lot of them have made the proper investments because I think a lot of them think brands are a visual identity. So I have a logo and a colorway, right? Like, and we're currently working on our millionth rebrand. And I can tell you it's not about the logo or the colorway. It's like the way the brand shows up, the way the bud tenders feel about the brand, our key
Right.
messaging, the environments. And um you don't need to spend $100,000 on a brand Bible and think that that's your brand. Like a brand is a feeling. And so, how are you making people feel? And what messages are you delivering to make them feel that way?
Yeah. 100%. And like it's living and breathing. And so the fact that you are revisiting your High Buds Club's, like, your positioning and your branding again makes a lot of sense because the industry continues to evolve and we're figuring out what's working. And so that's the other piece too, is it's like you don't do what you've always done. You need to do more of what's working. You need to be able to measure what's working. And you mentioned the critical thinking. This year, we have seen, it improve, I would say, overall. Like, marketers are looking at the full year. They're putting together plans. It's not so ad hoc. It's not so last minute. But there is a long way to go on that
No,
front.
for sure, for sure. I walked into 2025 knowing we were in a different climate than we had previously been in. I was seeing that a lot of the brands were giving me real briefs, real strategies. Like, I'm doing this because of this, not, oh, I need to sample. How do I get, 2,000 samples out a month at $5 a sample? Like, and so, I think that's like where the brands start to pull ahead, right? You have a real strategy. And when you have a real strategy, you know what you're trying to do. It's not ad hoc, to your point. You're not just throwing shit against the wall and hoping it works. And that way you can do something for a month, 2 months, 3 months, have your finger on the pulse. Oh, that doesn't work. Maybe I need to go 2 degrees left or 3 degrees right or like whatever that piece is. But if you have the right infrastructure and thinking in place, it becomes much easier to pivot on those decisions.
For sure. You have a decision-making lens, like, you've already established a plan, and you can make decisions based on that plan, based on your position, and then as you hire new team members, they're also making decisions based on that position and based on that plan, rather, yeah, than just throwing spaghetti at the wall, but, we all needed to do that. Like, this industry still needs to test. Like, not every piece of marketing is gonna deliver perfect KPIs and some perfect understanding about, and so there is, you got to leave room for trying new things. But trying new things isn't showing up in the most basic model. It's showing up in a more creative way and thinking of tactics that are really going to resonate with your target that goes beyond just a bud tender. It's a certain type of bud tender that would love your products. And that goes a little bit deeper. And so it's just this more sophisticated thinking that we're starting to see. And I think as there's more budget to hire great marketers in the space and fill those teams with extra skill set, I think we're just going to see more and more creativity.
I agree. I do want to poke on something you just said because I'm really curious about it. Do you think that the purpose of these events or the purpose of a lot of these brands is to build brands that bud tenders love for the bud tender? Or do you think the purpose is to build a profile of who the right consumer for these products are and then teach the bud tenders how to sell those products to those consumers?
Yeah, both of those things are very good strategies. I think for a lot of the brands right now, it's about just creating some noise in a market that's important to them. And so I think both those things you brought up are really good ways of trying to deepen that thinking and make that execution matter more to both your bottom line, but also your brand equity and what you're trying to do in the space.
Totally. I think a lot of the brands, we hear this a lot. Oh, the budtenders love us. And I think that that isn't scalable necessarily because that's a today strategy of like getting budtenders to recommend it. But the budtender is not your consumer. The budtender is meant to be your advocate in this world. And that's become what I've seen is quite an evolution is it used to be much more about the bud tenders, like, we gotta make them love us, and now it's like, we have to teach them how to sell our products, and it's nuanced, but it's different.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And then, kind of back to the velocity point and some of that other thinking, it's like if you're one of hundreds of SKUs. And so what is it going to take for you to stand out? And it's some of those pieces I mentioned earlier like you do need to sample, but you need a great rep. You need some brand storytelling, you need a brand reputation. And then, the number one thing is your product has to be good. Like, you can't sell a shitty product under a great brand and expect all's gonna go well. That doesn't work anywhere. So it's not gonna
Well,
work
it's not a
here.
great brand if it's a shitty product,
Exactly, exactly.
right? Like, branding is the driver, but if, you know, the person gets home and opens the bag and it's mid, but you're selling premium, like, doesn't equate.
No, exactly. And even like your customer service steps at that point, like, if a vape leaks or there's an issue, like how you deal with all of that is so connected to your brand and your brand storytelling and everything that sort of matters because those one-to-one interactions, especially in a negative way, turning those into positive, like that stuff matters so much. And there are some brands out there that do a phenomenal job and they are really transparent and they know how to deal with those issues and even in a public way, which I really admire because that's not always easy. It's sort of some crisis management, right? And then there's brands that just cower from issues, and that's for sure not the best approach. And it's going to hurt you at the end of the day.
Yeah, but I don't think they're thinking about that. That's the piece is like there's every action has a reaction, right? So you're showing up at the event and you have great reps. Well, the ripple of that is that people like your brand, they're more interested in your brand, they want to engage with it. Your reps show up and they're standoffish or a little rude, or a customer goes to complain about something or your product didn't, meet their expectation in the way that they thought it would. Well, if you don't service them appropriately and that you make them feel annoying or whatever the emotion is, like, well, you just lost a customer, you lost an advocate, and I don't think they think about that ripple of like what the reaction is.
Yeah. And we know budtenders move around. Like we know budtenders like a lot of them are staying in the industry, working at multiple stores in like a 5-year time period. And so their opinions are going to go with them. And, we have had um, one brand in particular that didn't treat all budtenders equally at one of our events because that retailer didn't purchase their product. Well, that became a big topic of conversation. It reflected very negatively on the brand itself. And, a lot of those budtenders were with their corporate store. Again, we know those people move around. And so it's you need a longer term vision. It goes beyond just like one interaction with someone, which I think is kind of the point of everything we've been saying. Like it is the sum of all parts. It's not just it's you need in other spaces it's like 10 to 12 brand engagements before someone even remembers you. Like that's a lot of work. You got to do a lot to get there. And so don't wreck it. don't
Well,
don't
that's
ruin your
it.
chances.
That's it. Don't make that person feel negatively about your brand. If you only have so many interactions, like use them well.
That's a really fair point.
But it's also, I mean, critical thinking and self-awareness. When you're 22, you don't have a lot of that, and I think that also, and I can go on a rant about this and I will not, but I also think that's about the talent pool that we're drawing from and who we're putting in positions in this industry that don't have the ability to perform.
Sure. Yeah. Like they're either too junior or on the other side, extremely talented, but expected to know everything. Like, as my background was always the brand side and then social and then into communicate. So they all sort of blend together. But like, I know enough to know like what I don't know and where talent sits in sort of each of those arenas. But a lot of people haven't had that kind of exposure. Like if you don't work for a large corporate company, you don't totally learn where all of the talent sits and how it really is, 10 different people in a full kind of marketing department. And so I think being saddled with everything forces even the really talented, smartest marketers to sort of cut some of their critical thinking short just to get the job. So that's like a bigger, a bigger issue for sure.
That's for a whole other podcast. Katie, thank you so much for joining me today. As we wrap it up, what does your spring summer calendar look like for Tether?
Yeah, thanks. So we've got Edmonton April 28th, Winnipeg May 1st, and then June 16th, we are in Vancouver. And then we have our big Ottawa event August 19th. And so that's our birthday celebration. And it's always a really good time. So that's sort of what's coming up over the next little bit.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining me. Really glad to have this conversation, and we'll chat soon.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Thanks.